Hello and welcome back to the channel. Once our fantastic and unforgettable journey through Alsace and the Black Forest is over, we embark on a new route to Spain. As there were still a few days left, we did not return directly to Spain, but decided to use the weekend in Andorra. Planning the way back to Andorra, we decided to extend the road a little and travel through the center of France and visit a sadly place in the history of World War II. This place is the remains of the small village of Oradour-sur-Glane, located very close to Limoges, which on June 10, 1944, was completely ravaged and massacred virtually all of its inhabitants. The place of the massacre is accessed through an interpretation center, where we will have a free and spacious parking space next to the interpretation center. As for the price of the entrance is about €8 and it is open practically all year round from 9 AM. In the center of interpretation, we will find a permanent exhibition with several spaces dedicated each to a different theme. In the first space, it talks about the submission of German society to the Nazi regime, the endeavor for Reich expansion, the war, and the French debacle in May 1940. In the second space, we are presented with the protagonists of the massacre, both the people and their inhabitants, as well as their Waffen SS deceivers. In the third space, we will see a documentary with testimonies of the survivors, confessions of the deer and the horror of discovering this massacre, reminding as well other massacres of this period. The fourth space is dedicated to the national recognition of the tragedy and the proclamation of the small village as village martyr, as well as the painful trials. Already in a fifth space, we find ourselves in a place dedicated to reflection. In the darkness of a naked space illuminated by some lights, in which we discover some texts that invite to meditation. Already from the center of memory, we access the Villa Motti, in whose entrance we see a simple word carved in stone. Remember. The truth is that when you enter, it looks like an abandoned village, until you remember the story of what happened here on June 10, 1944. Before that date, Oradour-sur-Glane was no more than a common village in the rural environment of the Limousin region, very close to Limoges, and that according to the 1936 census had 1574 inhabitants, of which 330 of them lived in the urban nucleus. On the eve of destruction, it retained its traditional character, enjoying a pleasant landscape, being even a source of inspiration for some artists. On both sides of the dotted streets, houses with wooden trunk were erected, as well as several small. It highlighted the church of the 15th century, with its 16th century bell tower being a monument catalogued by the then Administration of Fine Arts of Limousin. The village also had two hotels, whose restaurants were very frequented by the neighbors, and which used to host fishing-loving visitors on the Glane River. But all this changed on June 10, 1944, when an authentic massacre occurred here, in which virtually all of its inhabitants died, and the village was completely plundered and ravaged. On June 6, 1944, the Allied forces landed in Normandy. On June 7, the resistance attacked the German garrison in Tulle, about 100 kilometers south of Oradour-sur-Glane. On June 8, in view of the Normandy landing and the news received about the attack at Tulle, the German High Command decided to mobilize the 2nd SS Division, called Das Reich, which was stationed in Montauban, southwest of France. That same afternoon on day 8, a combat group of this division, made up of about 9,000 soldiers, arrives in the city of Tulle, taking control of it, and discovering the bodies of 39 dead Germans. Following this discovery, they decide to take retaliation against the civilian population, and the next day, several French male civilians are randomly selected and executed by hanging on balconies, trees, and lighthouses in multiple places of the city, for the public exhibition of their bodies. On June 9th, different units took positions in the commune of Oradour-sur-Glane, having a meeting between Waffen SS officers and the French militia of Limoges, where they decided to organize the action on Oradour-sur-Glane. And so we arrived on June 10th, about 2 p.m. A column composed of a dozen vehicles, 3 trucks, and 2 semi-Aruga armored vehicles removed the way of entry to Oradour-sur-Glane from the Limoges road, and part of the 150 soldiers commanded by Otto Dickmann, dressed in camouflage clothes, began their deployment through the urban core, while the 2 blinds took position in front of the church. The military sought the so-called tambour de ville, which would be a preacher, so that he would travel all the streets, summoning the inhabitants to the market square with the excuse of inspecting their identification documents. After about 20 minutes, the square was already filled with people, some of whom were sick and elderly, whom the German soldiers had forcibly pulled out of their homes, dragging them to the meeting point. Once there, Dickmann, with the excuse that the village served as a weapons warehouse of the resistance, orders to select 30 hostages at random, which the mayor denies. In the face of such a negative, the Waffen SS proceeds to separate men from women and children, bringing men to the outskirts of the village and women and kids to the church. Once women and children are led to the church, the explosion of a smoke grenade inside the church triggers a panic reaction in these poor souls. This is a reaction to which the soldiers of the Waffen SS respond by crushing them with their weapons. From the shooting, only one woman, Marguerite Roufange, was rescued, who was able to escape wounded by a window. As for the men who had been distributed into various groups by the people, the explosion of the smoke grenade in the church served as a signal for the soldiers of the Waffen SS, betrayed with heavy weapons, proceeded to shoot at the various groups. They were finished with guns, shooting at those who were still agonizing. Once this labor of extermination was completed, the bodies of all the murdered inhabitants were grouped and covered with living quicklime and subsequently set on fire. After this barbarism, the Waffen SS soldiers burned all the town buildings, leaving for Normandy on June 13th. 643 people were brutally murdered, including 190 men, 246 women, and 207 children. As for survivors, before the Germans had completely surrounded and controlled the village, about 80 people managed to flee. From the shooting or fire of the church, as we said earlier, only Marguerite Ruffin could be saved, which climbed a staircase that was used to light the candles and jumped out of a window. Although in the escape she was shot and wounded in her legs and a shoulder, losing in the massacre her husband, her 3 sons, and a 7-month-old grandson, being the only living witness to the church slaughter. As for the men, 5 of them, all of the same group, survived, save thanks to being left under the bodies of their comrades after the shooting, and pretended to be dead to avoid being fined by the Waffen SS pistol. When the soldiers set fire to the place, they managed to escape by making a hole in the wall, hiding in a hutch for about 3 hours, until they could finally get out of the village. Shortly after the massacre and destruction of Oradour-sur-Glane, on November 28, 1944, the provisional government takes the decision not to rebuild it, and keep it as it remained, as a reminder for future generations. On March 4, 1945, General Charles de Gaulle spoke to some of the survivors in his visit to the ruins. And the following year, in 1946, a law was approved that guaranteed that the ruins remained as they had been found after the massacre, being that same year the village martyr declared as a national monument, and building the new town right next to the ruins. As for those responsible for the massacre, in January 1953 it held a view that lasted a month, being played 65 survivors of the Waffen SS military and accused of their intervention in the killing. Of the 65 soldiers, only 21 could be brought before the court, 14 Alsatians and 7 Germans, while the rest were tried in rebellion. Only 2 of the accused were sentenced to death, and the rest, except for 1 case of absolution, were convicted of imprisonment or forced labor. During the Second World War, the Nazis exercised their control with iron hand, violence and repression against those who dare to resist. But in the Oradour-sur-Glane, the tragedy reached devastating proportions, leaving a legacy of indelible suffering and memory.